Look everyone, the family disappointment finally showed up, my daughter-in-law said into the microphone, and the entire reunion tent erupted in laughter. I smiled, adjusted the strap of my handbag and kept walking. At 68 years old, I had learned that some people reveal more about themselves in a single joke than they do in a lifetime of polite conversation. My name is Evelyn Brooks, and that afternoon was supposed to be a celebration of family. Instead, it became the day I finally understood how little respect some of my relatives had for me. The annual Brooks family reunion was being held at a large community park, just outside Columbus, Ohio. White tents stretched across the grass, folding tables overflowed with casseroles and homemade desserts, and children ran through the sunshine carrying paper plates piled high with food. From a distance, it looked like the kind of gathering people cherish for generations. The kind that ends with group photos and warm memories. But as I stepped out of my aging sedan and looked toward the crowd, a strange feeling settled in my chest. Maybe it was the way several conversations suddenly stopped when people noticed me. Maybe it was the way Heather, my daughter-in-law, immediately whispered something to a group standing beside her. Or maybe it was because deep down I already knew I didn't belong there anymore. Ever since my husband passed away 7 years earlier, things had changed. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just little things. Invitations arriving later than everyone else's. Family decisions being made without me. Conversations ending when I entered a room. The kind of cuts that never seem serious by themselves until one day you realize you've been bleeding for years. I carried a peach pie toward the main tent. The same recipe my mother taught me more than 50 years ago. It used to be everyone's favorite. My son Marcus loved it when he was a boy. He used to wait beside the oven, impatient for it to cool. Now he barely looked at me when I spoke. I spotted him near the beverage table wearing an expensive polo shirt and sunglasses. He was laughing with Heather and several cousins. For a moment I considered walking over to say hello. Before I could, Heather tapped her glass with a spoon. The familiar ringing sound cut through the crowd. Conversations stopped. Heads turned toward her. Heather loved attention. She always had. Before we start the Family Success Awards, she announced cheerfully, I think we should recognize everyone who made it here today. A few people clapped. I continued walking toward an empty chair near the back. Then Heather smiled. Especially Evelyn. More eyes turned toward me. Because no matter what happens in life, it takes courage to keep showing up. Laughter rippled through the audience. Some people chuckled politely. Others laughed harder than necessary. My face remained calm. Years ago, those comments would have wounded me. That day I simply listened. After all, Heather continued, every family needs at least one disappointment so the rest of us know what success looks like. This time the laughter came louder. Even some relatives I barely recognized joined in. I looked toward Marcus. My son. My only child. Surely he would say something. Surely he would tell his wife she'd gone too far. Instead, he lowered his head and smiled into his drink. Something inside me grew very quiet. Not angry. Not hurt. Just quiet. I finally reached the chair and sat down. The reunion carried on as if nothing unusual had happened. Children played. Music drifted through the speakers. Plates clattered. Yet I noticed people glancing toward me every few minutes. Curious. Amused. Certain they already knew my story. What none of them understood was that the story they had invented about me was completely wrong. They believed they knew who I was because of the car I drove, the clothes I wore, and the simple life I lived. They thought modest meant unsuccessful. They thought quiet meant weak. They thought they had already measured my worth. Across the field, I noticed a large display board decorated with family photographs. Beneath each picture was a small printed description. Doctors, attorneys, entrepreneurs, business owners. Then I found mine. Under my smiling photograph were 4 words. Family disappointment of the year. The crowd kept laughing. I kept smiling. And for the first time that afternoon, I wondered what their faces would look like once they learned the truth. I sat there for several minutes staring at that display board while the reunion continued around me. Children chased one another across the grass. Someone started a game of cornhole near the picnic tables. Country music drifted from the speakers hanging beneath the tent. Life went on as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet every time I looked at those 4 words beneath my photograph, I felt less hurt and more curious. Family disappointment of the year. It was such a confident judgment, such a certain conclusion. I wondered how many conversations had taken place behind my back before someone printed that sign. I wondered how many people had nodded in agreement. The strange thing was that nobody there actually knew much about my life. They only knew the version they had created for themselves. To them, I was the widow who still drove an old car. The woman who bought clothes from department store clearance racks. The relative who never talked about investments, vacations, or luxury purchases. In their minds, simplicity had become evidence of failure. I looked across the field and spotted my cousin Richard standing beside a new pickup truck. I remembered when he lost his job 15 years earlier and called me in tears because he was 3 months behind on his mortgage payments. I had quietly mailed him a check large enough to save his house. He never told anyone where the money came from. Nearby stood my niece Amanda, proudly showing photographs of her newly renovated kitchen. 10 years ago, when her daughter needed emergency medical treatment that insurance would not fully cover, I had helped pay the remaining bills. Nobody knew that either. I never expected gratitude. I certainly never expected recognition. But watching them laugh now, I realized something important. Most of the people judging me had benefited from kindness they never bothered to remember. A voice interrupted my thoughts. "Evelyn, there you are." I looked up and saw Grace Carter approaching with 2 paper cups of lemonade. Grace was one of the few relatives who still treated me like a human being instead of a cautionary tale. She lowered herself into the chair beside me and handed me a cup. "I saw the sign," she said quietly. "I am sorry." I shrugged and took a sip. "It is not the worst thing they have said about me." Grace shook her head. "No. But it might be the most public." For a moment neither of us spoke. We simply watched the crowd. Then Grace leaned closer. "Do they really have no idea?" she asked. I almost laughed. "Not a clue." Her expression softened. "And you never planned to tell them?" I looked toward Marcus. He was standing with Heather near the main stage, laughing with a group of cousins. My son looked successful, confident, important. Yet I could not remember the last time he asked how I was doing. Not politely, not out of obligation, truly asked. "People who measure worth by appearances usually stop looking after the surface," I said. Grace smiled faintly. "That sounds like something your husband would have said." The mention of Daniel brought a warm ache to my chest. Daniel had understood me better than anyone. Before he passed away, he used to remind me that patience reveals character. Time exposes motives. Eventually, people tell you exactly who they are. You only have to listen. Across the reunion grounds, Heather stepped back to the microphone again. The crowd slowly gathered near the stage. Another round of speeches was about to begin. Grace glanced at me. "This should be interesting." I followed her gaze toward the growing audience. For the first time all afternoon, I noticed a large envelope inside my handbag. It had been sitting there quietly the entire day, waiting, just like I had. And something told me that before this reunion was over, the people who thought they knew everything about Evelyn Brooks were about to discover how wrong they had been. People slowly gathered in front of the stage as folding chairs scraped across the grass. The afternoon sun hung low enough to cast long shadows beneath the tents, and the air carried the familiar scent of barbecue and fresh-cut grass. I remained seated beside Grace, watching relatives settle into their places. Some were still laughing about earlier jokes. Others balanced paper plates on their laps while waiting for the next activity. Heather stood confidently at the microphone with a clipboard in her hand. She looked pleased with herself. She always did when she was controlling the room. "All right, everyone," she announced. "It is time for our family success spotlight." A round of applause followed. Heather smiled broadly. "We thought it would be fun to let a few family members share their biggest accomplishments from the past year." The first speaker was my cousin Richard. He walked to the stage and spent several minutes describing a business expansion that involved new equipment and additional employees. The crowd applauded. Then Amanda shared details about her renovated home. More applause followed. One by one, relatives stepped forward to discuss promotions, investments, vacations, and purchases. Every story seemed carefully designed to impress. Every achievement was measured by money, status, or appearances. As I listened, I noticed something I had never fully seen before. Nobody talked about kindness. Nobody mentioned helping others. Nobody described being a good parent, a loyal spouse, or a dependable friend. Success, at least in that crowd, seemed to have only one definition. Grace leaned toward me. This feels less like a reunion and more like a competition. I smiled faintly. That is because it is. She nodded knowingly. Eventually Heather returned to the microphone. And now, she said dramatically, we have one final participant. Her eyes moved directly toward me. Several heads turned. I could almost feel the anticipation spreading through the audience. Come on up, Evelyn, Heather said. We would all love to hear about your year. A few people laughed softly. Others exchanged amused glances. Marcus stood near the side of the stage with his arms crossed. He did not say anything. He never stopped Heather when she turned me into entertainment. I rose slowly from my chair and picked up my handbag. The large envelope remained inside, untouched, waiting. As I walked across the grass, conversations quieted. Every step seemed strangely calm. I was not nervous. I was not angry. I simply felt tired of pretending not to notice what had been happening for years. When I reached the stage, Heather handed me the microphone. Take your time, she said with a smile that never reached her eyes. I know you probably do not have quite as much to report as everyone else. More laughter drifted through the crowd. I looked at the faces before me. Cousins, nieces, nephews, family friends, people who believed they already understood my life. For a moment I considered telling them about the volunteer work I quietly supported. I considered mentioning the students whose tuition assistance I had funded. I considered sharing the countless times I had helped relatives through difficult seasons without asking for recognition. Instead, I asked a simple question. What do all of you believe success means? The crowd grew still. Several people looked confused. Heather blinked. What? She asked. I repeated the question. What does success mean? Jason, one of my younger relatives, answered first. Money, he said confidently. A few people laughed and nodded. Someone else shouted, financial freedom. Another voice added, being able to buy whatever you want. Marcus finally spoke. Security, he said. Building wealth for your family. I listened carefully and nodded after each answer. Then I looked across the audience one more time. Every face seemed certain. Every person appeared convinced that success could be measured and displayed. Slowly, I reached into my handbag. The crowd watched. Heather watched. Marcus watched. My fingers closed around the envelope. And for the first time that afternoon, the room became completely silent. My fingers rested on the edge of the envelope while dozens of eyes remained fixed on me. Nobody spoke. Even the children running across the park seemed quieter somehow. I looked down at the thick stack of papers inside and then back at the crowd. That is an interesting list of answers, I said. Money, wealth, expensive things, financial freedom. Several people nodded. Jason crossed his arms confidently. Heather stood nearby with a satisfied smile, clearly expecting me to prove exactly why she believed I deserved that sign beneath my photograph. I slowly removed a single sheet of paper from the envelope but did not reveal it yet. Instead, I folded it against my chest and continued speaking. When my husband Daniel passed away 7 years ago, many people assumed my life had fallen apart. The audience remained silent. Some of you probably remember that time. I sold the large house. I stopped attending expensive vacations. I drove the same car year after year. I stopped buying things I did not need. A few relatives exchanged glances. And somewhere along the way, people decided that meant I had failed. Heather laughed softly. Well, appearances matter, Evelyn. Several people chuckled. I smiled politely. That is exactly my point. I stepped away from the microphone stand and looked toward the family display board in the distance. You see, I spent years listening to assumptions. People assumed I was struggling because I lived modestly. They assumed I was lonely because I kept to myself. They assumed I was unsuccessful because I never talked about money. Grace sat quietly near the front row, watching everything unfold. She already knew where this conversation was heading. Everyone else did not. What nobody ever asked was whether I was happy, I said. Nobody asked whether I had enough. Nobody asked what I actually valued. A breeze moved through the tent, rustling napkins and paper plates. The crowd listened more carefully now. Even Heather seemed less certain than before. For years I watched family members compete with one another. Bigger houses, newer vehicles, more expensive vacations, promotions, titles, status. I paused briefly. There is nothing wrong with success, but there is something dangerous about measuring human worth by what people choose to show you. Marcus shifted his weight near the stage. For the first time all afternoon, he looked uncomfortable. "Mom," he said cautiously, "what exactly are you trying to say?" I turned toward him. My son, the little boy who once sat beside me on the kitchen floor helping me bake peach pies. The boy who used to believe I could solve any problem in the world. "I am saying that assumptions can be expensive mistakes," I replied. Then I finally unfolded the paper in my hands. The audience leaned forward almost instinctively. Heather stared directly at the document. Jason narrowed his eyes. Richard adjusted his glasses. Nobody laughed anymore. "A few years ago," I continued, "I received some advice from Daniel. He told me that money is most useful when it gives you freedom, not attention. So I followed that advice. I lifted the paper slightly. I invested carefully. I lived below my means. I stayed patient. And I never felt the need to announce it at family gatherings." The silence deepened. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. Nobody on the stage seemed to notice. Every face remained fixed on the paper in my hands. Heather's confident smile had disappeared completely. Marcus looked confused. Several relatives appeared genuinely nervous now. I could almost see them trying to calculate possibilities in their minds. Slowly, I looked across the audience one final time. "Earlier today," I said, "many of you agreed that success means financial security." I glanced down at the statement and then back up again. If that is true, then perhaps it is time we all looked at the numbers together. The silence lingered for several seconds after I spoke. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for their food. Even Heather seemed frozen beside the microphone stand. I looked down at the statement in my hands and then back at the faces staring at me. Some appeared skeptical. Others looked curious. A few suddenly seemed worried. "Before I show you anything," I said calmly, "I want to tell you a story." My voice carried easily through the speakers. The crowd listened. 7 years ago, after Daniel passed away, many people assumed I was entering the hardest chapter of my life. In some ways they were right. Losing him left a space in my world that could never be filled. Every room felt quieter. Every holiday felt smaller. Every decision felt heavier. Several relatives lowered their eyes. For a moment, the reunion felt less like a competition and more like a family gathering. What most people did not realize, I continued, was that Daniel and I spent decades preparing for uncertainty. We were not wealthy when we got married. Far from it. We lived in a small 2-bedroom house. We repaired things instead of replacing them. We saved when others spent. We invested when others upgraded. I smiled slightly as memories returned. I still remember Daniel bringing home old investment books from the public library. We would sit at the kitchen table after dinner studying them together, while everyone else we knew was chasing the newest trends. A few people chuckled softly. It was not exciting. It was not glamorous. But it worked. I noticed Richard staring at me with growing attention. Amanda looked thoughtful now. Even Jason no longer seemed amused. Year after year we made the same decision. We chose patience over appearances. We chose security over status. We chose freedom over attention. I held up the statement but kept the numbers hidden. Then Daniel gave me one final piece of advice. He told me that if I ever became the richest person in the room, I should never feel the need to announce it. A few nervous laughs drifted through the audience. Heather did not laugh. Marcus remained completely still. "For 7 years I followed that advice," I said. "I volunteered. I traveled when I wanted to. I read books. I spent time with friends. I lived exactly the life I wanted." Then I paused. And all that time people kept assuming I was struggling. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some people pitied me. Some ignored me. Some judged me. And a few apparently decided I deserved a public award. My eyes briefly moved toward the display board in the distance. Nobody laughed this time. The interesting thing about assumptions is that they reveal more about the person making them than the person receiving them. Grace smiled from her seat. She had heard me say that before. Daniel used to say it often. I slowly unfolded the statement completely. The paper fluttered lightly in the afternoon breeze. Earlier today, many of you said success means financial security. I looked toward Jason. You said money. Then I glanced toward Marcus. You said wealth built over time. Finally, I turned toward the crowd as a whole. Well, after decades of investing and 7 years of quiet growth, I can honestly say Daniel and I achieved exactly what we set out to achieve. I lowered my eyes to the statement one last time before lifting it high enough for the people in the front rows to see. The reaction was immediate. Several heads jerked forward. Someone gasped softly. Another person whispered, "That cannot be right." I heard the sound before I saw it. The collective intake of breath spreading through the audience like a wave. And in that moment, I knew the story they had been telling about Evelyn Brooks had just come to an end. For several long seconds, nobody said a word. The only sounds came from a distant lawnmower somewhere beyond the park and the gentle rustling of leaves overhead. I stood on the stage holding the statement while the crowd tried to process what they had seen. The number printed on that page was larger than anything most of them had imagined. Years of careful investing, disciplined decisions, and patience had quietly grown into a level of financial security that completely contradicted the story they had built about me. Jason was the first to speak. "That has to be some kind of mistake," he said. His voice sounded less confident than before. I looked at him calmly. "It is not." Richard adjusted his glasses and stared toward the document again. Amanda covered her mouth with one hand. Several relatives began whispering among themselves. The same people who had laughed at me less than an hour earlier were suddenly looking at me as though they had never seen me before. Heather stepped closer to the microphone. "Well," she said with a nervous laugh, "that is certainly impressive." Her tone had changed completely. Gone was the sarcasm. Gone was the confidence. For the first time all afternoon, she seemed unsure of herself. "You never told anyone," she added. "Nobody asked," I replied. Another silence followed. Marcus finally walked toward the stage. He looked stunned. "Mom," he said quietly, "how long has this been true?" I studied his face. There was confusion there. Surprise. Regret perhaps. But there was something else as well. Calculation. The same calculation I had seen in many faces throughout my life whenever money entered a conversation. "A long time," I answered. "Long before today." Marcus shook his head slowly. "I had no idea." "That is correct," I said. "You did not." He lowered his eyes. I remembered all the phone calls that never came. All the holidays where conversations lasted only a few minutes. All the times he accepted Heather's opinions about me without ever asking for my side of the story. The distance between us had not appeared overnight. It had grown one small decision at a time. "Why would you keep something like this secret?" someone asked from the audience. I looked toward the crowd. "Because money reveals character," I said. "Not the character of the person who has it. The character of the people who discover it." The whispers grew louder. Heads turned. Expressions shifted. It was already happening. People who had ignored me earlier were now paying close attention to every word. People who had treated me like an embarrassment suddenly seemed eager to hear more. Grace watched quietly from her chair. She noticed it too. "For years," I continued, "many of you believed I was unsuccessful because I lived simply. Yet none of you ever asked whether I was content. None of you ever asked whether my life was meaningful. You saw an old car and assumed failure. You saw modest clothing and assumed struggle. You saw a widow living quietly and assumed weakness." Several relatives looked away. The truth has a way of making eye contact difficult. Heather folded her arms. "I think people were only joking," she said. I nodded slowly. "That sign on the display board was a joke?" Her cheeks flushed slightly. "It was meant to be light-hearted." "Interesting," I replied, because nobody seemed concerned about my feelings when they believed I had nothing. The crowd became silent again. Nobody laughed. Nobody defended the sign. Nobody defended the award. Suddenly it no longer felt harmless. Suddenly everyone could see it for what it really was. I carefully placed the statement back into the envelope. The numbers had already done their work. They were no longer important. What mattered was what had happened to the room. In less than 10 minutes, admiration had replaced ridicule. Curiosity had replaced dismissal. Respect had appeared out of nowhere. And that transformation told me far more about my family than any bank statement ever could. The atmosphere around the reunion changed so quickly it almost felt unreal. Only an hour earlier, people had avoided sitting near me. Now relatives who had barely spoken to me in years suddenly seemed eager to start conversations. As I stepped away from the microphone, several family members approached the stage. Richard was first. "Evelyn," he said warmly, placing a hand over his heart. "I had no idea how well you were doing. That is wonderful news." I smiled politely. "Thank you, Richard." A few months earlier he had forgotten my birthday entirely. Amanda appeared next. "You always were the smartest one in the family," she said. "I remember telling people that years ago." I nodded. I did not remind her that she had spent most of the afternoon laughing with everyone else. One by one the compliments arrived. They sounded different, but they all carried the same message. Suddenly, I was no longer the family disappointment. Suddenly I was interesting, valuable, worth listening to. I slowly descended the steps from the stage and returned to my chair beside Grace. She watched the crowd gathering around me and shook her head. "That did not take long," she said quietly. "No," I replied. "It never does." Across the field, I noticed Heather speaking rapidly with Marcus. They stood close together, both glancing toward me every few seconds. Their expressions were serious now, focused. Whatever conversation they were having, it was very different from the one they had been having earlier. Grace followed my gaze. "What do you think they are discussing?" she asked. I took a sip of lemonade. "Probably the same thing everyone else is discussing. Money." I nodded. "Money." A few minutes later, Marcus began walking toward us. Heather followed close behind. The moment I saw them approaching, I felt a familiar sadness. Not because I feared the conversation, because I already knew exactly how it would begin. Marcus stopped beside my chair. His smile looked strained. "Mom," he said, "can we talk?" I gestured toward an empty seat. "Of course." Heather sat down first. "Evelyn," she began, her voice noticeably softer than before. "I think maybe there has been some misunderstanding over the years." Grace lowered her eyes to hide a smile. I remained silent. Heather continued. "If anything I said earlier upset you, I am sorry." There it was. Not an apology. A negotiation disguised as one. "That is very kind of you," I said. "Thank you." Marcus leaned forward. "Mom, we should spend more time together." The words sounded almost rehearsed. "Family is important." I looked at him carefully. Family was important this morning too. His expression tightened. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Heather quickly changed the subject. "Actually, there is something we wanted your opinion on." Of course there was. "Really?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "Marcus has been exploring a business opportunity. A very promising one." Grace quietly looked away so nobody would see her reaction. I already understood where this conversation was heading. "A business opportunity," I repeated. "That sounds exciting." Marcus nodded eagerly. "We have been considering an expansion project. The returns could be incredible." "I see." Heather smiled. "And after hearing about your investment success today, we thought maybe you would have some advice." Advice. Another interesting word. Not money. Not investment. Not assistance. Advice. Yet the expectation hanging in the air was impossible to miss. Around us, other relatives were beginning to drift closer. Not close enough to seem obvious. Just close enough to overhear. The same people who had laughed at me now listened with great interest. I sat quietly for a moment, studying their faces. Then I realized something important. The bank statement had not changed who I was. It had changed who they revealed themselves to be. For a moment nobody spoke. The small circle around my chair continued to grow as more relatives drifted closer, pretending to be interested in the reunion activities while clearly listening to every word. Marcus and Heather sat across from me. both waiting for my response. The difference between their behavior now and their behavior earlier that afternoon was impossible to ignore. A few hours ago I had been a joke. Now I was suddenly a source of wisdom. What kind of business opportunity? I asked. Marcus immediately straightened in his chair. Commercial property, he said. There is a development project outside Cincinnati. The investors expect strong growth over the next few years. Heather nodded enthusiastically. It is a great opportunity. I smiled politely. Then I assume you already have financing. The brief silence that followed answered the question before either of them spoke. Heather glanced toward Marcus. Marcus looked down at the grass. We are still working through a few details, he admitted. Of course, I said. Around us, several relatives continued listening. Richard had somehow wandered much closer than before. Amanda stood nearby holding a paper cup she had not taken a sip from in 10 minutes. Even Jason had found a reason to remain within earshot. You know, I said calmly. It is interesting how many people suddenly want financial conversations today. Heather laughed nervously. Well, after what everyone learned, can you blame them? I looked directly at her. Actually, yes. Her smile faded. The group became quiet again. Earlier today, I continued, I was sitting alone while people laughed at a sign calling me a disappointment. Nobody asked about my investment strategy then. Nobody asked for my opinion. Nobody seemed interested in my experience. Several faces lowered toward the ground. Then a number appeared on a piece of paper, and suddenly everything changed. Jason folded his arms. People were just surprised. Perhaps, I replied. But surprise is not what I see. Nobody interrupted. What I see is that many people spend years deciding how much respect someone deserves based entirely on appearances. They admire expensive things. They dismiss simple things. They confuse wealth with character. My eyes moved across the crowd. And then they wonder why they misjudge people. Grace sat quietly beside me, allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it needed to. Marcus exhaled slowly. Mom, maybe some mistakes were made. I nodded. Maybe. But we are family. There it was. The phrase appeared exactly when I expected it would. Family. A word people often remembered when they wanted something. We are family, I agreed. Which makes this afternoon even more disappointing. Heather shifted uncomfortably. I already apologized. No, I said gently. You apologized after you saw the statement. The words landed harder than I intended. Heather looked away. Nobody rushed to defend her. Even Marcus remained silent. A real apology arrives before the consequences, I continued. Not after. The breeze moved through the park once again. Somewhere behind us, children laughed near the playground. The reunion continued, but the energy around our table felt completely different now. Let me ask all of you something, I said. If that bank statement had shown $5,000 instead of what it showed today, would this conversation still be happening? Nobody answered. Richard looked away. Amanda stared into her cup. Jason suddenly seemed fascinated by the ground beneath his shoes. The silence itself became the answer. I smiled sadly. That is what I thought. Then I stood up from my chair. The crowd instinctively watched. Every eye followed me. The most valuable thing I learned from Daniel was not how to build wealth, I said. It was how to recognize people. And today has been a very educational day. No one laughed. No one argued. Because deep down, every person standing there understood exactly what I meant. The crowd remained quiet after I spoke. Nobody seemed eager to continue the conversation. The confidence that had filled the reunion earlier in the afternoon had disappeared, replaced by something far less comfortable. Reflection. I looked around at the faces gathered near the tables and beneath the tents. Some appeared embarrassed. Some looked thoughtful. A few still seemed uncertain about what to say. For the first time all day, nobody was trying to impress anyone. I reached for my handbag and prepared to leave the stage area. Before I could take a step, Marcus stood up. Mom, he said. His voice sounded different now. Not polished. Not strategic. Just tired. I turned toward him. Yes. He hesitated. I think I owe you an apology. The crowd remained silent. Nobody interrupted. Marcus looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. Not because of the money. Because of everything. I waited. I should have spoken up earlier. About the sign. About the jokes. About the way people treated you. His voice softened. I saw it happening and I told myself it was harmless. It was easier to stay quiet than to do the right thing. I studied his face. For the first time that afternoon, I saw honesty instead of calculation. Not perfection. Not redemption. Just honesty. Thank you for saying that, I replied. Heather stood beside him. She looked uncomfortable but determined. I owe you one too, she said quietly. I convinced myself it was all in good fun. I never stopped to think about how it would feel from your side. I nodded. That happens more often than people realize. She lowered her eyes. I am sorry. The apology was simple. Imperfect. But unlike the earlier one, it did not seem connected to opportunity. It seemed connected to understanding. Around us, several relatives looked relieved. The tension that had gripped the reunion for hours finally began to ease. Grace smiled softly from her chair. I could almost hear Daniel's voice in my memory. People reveal themselves eventually. You only have to pay attention. I looked across the reunion grounds one last time. The display board still stood near the tent. My photograph was still there. The sign beneath it remained exactly where it had been all afternoon. Family disappointment of the year. I walked toward it slowly. Several people followed at a distance. When I reached the board, I carefully removed the sign and folded it in half. Then I placed it inside my handbag. Why keep it? Jason asked from behind me. I turned and smiled. Because it reminds me of something important. He looked confused. What? I glanced around at the family gathered there. That other people do not get to decide your value. Nobody spoke. For years, many of you measured success by appearances. A title. A salary. A vehicle. A house. A bank account. I paused. The truth is that every one of those things can disappear. The crowd listened quietly. Character stays. Kindness stays. Integrity stays. Those are the things that matter when nobody is watching. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink lower across the park. Families were packing up chairs. Children were helping carry coolers toward parked cars. The reunion was coming to an end. I spent years thinking people misunderstood me, I said. Today I realized something different. The people who mattered never misunderstood me at all. My eyes moved toward Grace. She smiled. Then toward Marcus. Then toward the rest of the family. And the people who judged me based on appearances gave me a valuable lesson. I placed my handbag over my shoulder and started walking toward my car. What lesson? Someone called out. I stopped and looked back one final time. That the richest person in the room is not the one with the biggest bank statement. The crowd remained silent. It is the person who never needed one to know their own worth. Then I walked away beneath the evening sky feeling lighter than I had in years. Not because anyone finally knew what was in my bank account, but because I no longer cared whether they did.